She had nothing left. He had even less reason to care. But what they built together would make an entire town choke on its own laughter. In the winter of 1887, a blind widow stood in the snow outside a courthouse with $14 to her name and a debt she couldn't pay. Every soul in Black Ridge watched and waited for her to fall. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that she'd already been planning her revenge for 3 years. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, hit that like button, and stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. The morning Silas Mercer rode into Black Ridge with a mule, a broken pack saddle, and the smell of 6 weeks in the mountains on him, he had no intention of staying longer than it took to sell his furs and buy flour. That was the plan. Plans, in Silas's experience, were things other people made. He came down off the ridge trail at 7:30, just as the sky over the Callaway Peaks was shifting from black to the particular shade of gray that promised nothing good. Not warmth, not sun, not mercy. The kind of sky that made honest men want to stay indoors and dishonest men feel right at home. His mule, a bad-tempered animal named Cobb that he'd owned for 4 years and never once liked, picked her way down the frozen switchbacks with the careful resentment of a creature doing a job she didn't choose. Silas rode with his rifle across his lap and his collar up. He didn't talk to Cobb. He didn't talk much to anyone. Black Ridge sat at the bottom of the valley like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten about. 40-some buildings, maybe 200 people if you counted the outlying homesteads. A trading post, a saloon, a church nobody attended with much conviction, a bank that was slightly more powerful than either of those, and the kind of general store where the owner knew everything about everybody and wasn't above sharing it. Silas had been coming through Black Ridge twice a year for going on 6 years. He knew the layout, knew the faces, knew which men to avoid and which debts to settle quietly. He wasn't from here. He wasn't really from anywhere in particular, which suited him fine. He tied Cobb outside the trading post and went in to get his furs weighed. Dunmore, the trader, was a heavy man with ink-stained fingers and the habit of sucking his teeth when he was thinking. He ran his hands over the stack of pelts Silas had dropped on his counter and made a series of sounds that communicated nothing clearly. 6 weeks' work, Silas said. I can see that. Then stop making noises and tell me what you're paying. Dunmore sucked his teeth. Beavers down. Minks holding. These fox are good. He named a number. Silas named a different number. They settled on something in between, which was how it always went. Silas walked out with enough to cover his winter supplies, replaced 2 traps that had given out on him in November, and maybe, afford a room at the boarding house for one night so he could sleep somewhere that didn't have wind coming through the walls. He was standing on the trading post steps counting his money when he heard the noise from down the street. Not a fight. Something slower than that. Worse, maybe. A crowd. Silas had an instinct about crowds that had served him well over the years. Avoid them. Whatever had drawn a crowd together, it was rarely something a man on the outside needed to involve himself in. He'd learned this the hard way more than once. He pocketed his money. He looked down the street, and then he looked anyway, because he was only human. There were maybe 30 people gathered outside the office of the Callaway Valley Savings and Commerce Bank, which was the official name of an institution everyone just called Hargrove's Bank, after the man who ran it. They'd spilled off the boardwalk and into the frozen mud of the street, and they had that particular quality a crowd gets when it's watching something bad happen to someone else, with a mixture of genuine pity and private relief that it isn't them. Silas moved to the edge of the crowd and looked. A woman stood in the street in front of the bank steps. She was perhaps 40 or perhaps younger than that, and worn by weather and grief. It was hard to tell. She wore a dress that had been good once, maybe 2 winters ago. Her coat was the kind of thin that made you feel cold just looking at it. She held herself very straight, which took effort, and her eyes were fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with what was in front of her. She was blind. Silas could tell by the way she oriented herself to sounds rather than shapes, her head turning slightly toward each new voice, a fractional adjustment for each footstep on the frozen ground. The slight over-deliberateness in how she held her hands at her sides, like she'd learned long ago that reaching for things you can't see makes people uncomfortable, so you keep still instead. Standing beside her and not quite touching her in any way that could be called supportive was a younger woman who might have been a neighbor. The neighbor looked embarrassed to be there, the way people do when they've accompanied someone to a public humiliation they can't stop. On the bank steps, a man Silas didn't recognize was reading from a document in a voice clearly pitched to Carrie. Outstanding balance of $212, inclusive of the late fees applied pursuant to the terms of the original agreement, for which the Ashcroft property at the foot of Mill Creek Road is hereby named as collateral and subject to— "You've said all this already," the woman in the street said. Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge in it that cut right through the crowd noise. "You've said all of it twice. I don't need it read a third time." "Mrs. Ashcroft," the man on the steps said, and there was a patient cruelty in how he said it, the patience of someone who knows they've already won. "The law requires— I know what the law requires." Someone in the crowd laughed. A short, mean sound. $212. To people who had that kind of money in their pockets, it was almost funny. What a woman could lose everything over. To people who didn't, it was the kind of number that lived in nightmares. Silas stood at the edge of the crowd and watched the blind woman in the street hold herself straight. He should have left. He knew he should have left. "How long?" he asked the man standing next to him, a farmer type with a weathered face and no particular expression. The man glanced at him. "How long what?" "How long before they take the property?" The farmer thought about it. "Hargrove gave her until end of business today. That's—" he squinted at the sun. 2, maybe 3 hours. Silas looked at the money in his hand. The money he'd just counted. The money from 6 weeks of work in the mountains, in the cold, eating salt pork and sleeping under frost. He thought about the flour he needed, the traps, the boarding house room. "Don't," said the part of him that had kept him alive this long. He walked toward the bank. He didn't push through the crowd. He moved around the edge of it, which took longer but caused less trouble, and came out near the steps. The man with the document, a bank clerk of some kind, young enough that his authority over this situation was clearly borrowed, looked up from his papers with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted while doing something they were certain was righteous. "You need something?" the clerk said. "I need to speak to Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove is occupied." "Then unoccupy him." The clerk opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Silas, at the size of him, at the rifle, at the calm particular to men who have spent long periods of time completely alone and have stopped worrying much about other people's opinions, and turned and went inside. Mrs. Ashcroft had turned toward the sound of his voice. Her head was tilted at a slight angle, the way he'd noticed blind people sometimes did, as though sound carried more information through a different approach. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice wasn't grateful. It wasn't afraid. It was just direct, which he appreciated. "Silas Mercer. I trap. I come through Black Ridge twice a year." "I don't know you." "No reason you would." "Then why—" "I want to ask Hargrove a question," Silas said. "That's all. What he answers will determine what happens after that." She was quiet for a moment. "And if I told you not to? If I told you I didn't want your help?" He looked at her. She was facing him precisely, which meant she'd fixed his location from his voice. Her hands were still at her sides, completely still. Her face was not calm exactly, something harder than calm. "Then I'd thank you for the information," he said, "and I'd walk away." Another pause. Shorter. "Ask your question," she said. Hargrove was a man who looked like money that had gone slightly soft. He was somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that might have been handsome once and now just looked expensive. He wore a good suit and kept a warm office, and he looked at Silas the way men like him always looked at men like Silas, with a combination of wariness and contempt that was the natural product of someone who'd spent his life calculating other people's worth. "Mr. Mercer," he didn't offer his hand. "I'm told you have a question." "The Ashcroft debt." Hargrove settled back in his chair. $212, as has been publicly read. Twice. "Is it real?" Something moved across Hargrove's face. "I beg your pardon?" "The debt. Is it real and legitimate? Or is there something else happening here?" Hargrove smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "The debt is fully documented, fully legal, and fully due. Evelyn Ashcroft borrowed against her property following her husband's death. She has failed repeatedly to service that debt. The law is clear. The land at the foot of Mill Creek Road, Silas said. What's on it? A derelict homestead and roughly 12 acres of... There's a creek. Hargrove paused. Yes. Running water, year-round? I suppose. I'm not certain what relevance. What'd you plan to do with the property once you take it? Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. That is not a matter that concerns you. I'm making it concern me, Silas said. $212. If I pay that today, right now, the debt is cleared. Correct. The silence in the room stretched out. Technically, Hargrove said slowly, yes. Under the terms of the original, then get your paperwork. Check. He paid it in cash on the counter of Hargrove's office, with the banker watching him with an expression Silas filed away as something to remember. Not anger, something more careful than anger. The look of a man revising a plan. He didn't think about it too hard. He'd made the decision. Second-guessing decisions was something he'd also stopped doing somewhere around age 28 after learning that the paralysis of second-guessing was more dangerous than the decision itself. He was left with $11 to his name. No flour. No traps. He came back out into the cold. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, it had grown, word having passed through the town the way word always passed through small towns, instantly and with embellishment. They were all looking at him. Evelyn Ashcroft was standing exactly where he'd left her. It's done, he said. She didn't move. How much? Doesn't matter. How much, she said again, and this time it wasn't a question. 212. Something crossed her face. He couldn't name it precisely. It moved through too fast. I'll pay you back, she said. All right? I mean it. I know you do. Someone in the crowd, he didn't see who, said something in a low voice, and 2 or 3 people nearby laughed. Silas caught the word wife and understood immediately that some local custom or joke was being referenced that he wasn't party to. He turned and looked at the crowd with the kind of look that stopped laughter cold, and then turned back. Is there somewhere we can talk? He said. Somewhere that isn't this. My property, Evelyn said. Such as it is. The homestead at the foot of Mill Creek Road was, and Silas was a man who believed in being honest with himself, a disaster. Not a hopeless disaster. He was a builder, among other things, and he could look at structures the way a surgeon looks at an injury. Clearly, without flinching, seeing what could be saved and what couldn't. The main cabin had a sound frame despite the rot in 2 of the lower beams. The outbuildings were worse, but not gone. The creek ran strong and clear 40 feet from the near wall, loud enough that he could hear it even through the wind. He stood in the yard with Evelyn beside him, and she stood in the same way she'd stood outside the bank. Straight, still, hands quiet at her sides, except here there was something different about it. Here she was oriented in a way that suggested familiarity. She knew where everything was. She'd built the map of this place in her head over years and kept it maintained. The creek, she said. You asked about it. It's strong. My late husband believed it ran strong enough to support a mill wheel. He spent the last 2 years of his life planning to build one. A pause. He never started. There was always a reason to wait. Bad timing, not enough money, one more winter. Another pause, shorter. He died before any of it got past paper. But you have the plans. Evelyn turned her head slightly. I have better than plans. I have 3 years of memorizing everything he documented, every measurement, every engineering note, every calculation. She touched the side of her head. A brief gesture, almost self-conscious. In here. Silas looked at the creek, looked at the site, looked back at her. You want to build it, he said. I want to build it, she said. It wasn't a wish or a dream. It was a statement of fact that had been waiting for the right moment. A sawmill. The only water-powered sawmill in the Callaway frontier. There's not another one within 100 miles. She turned to face him with the uncanny precision he was beginning to get used to. The merchants in this valley are paying twice what lumber should cost, because everything has to be hauled in. A working mill on this creek would change everything. Silas was quiet for a moment. I'm a trapper, he said. You're also a builder. I could hear it in how you walked through the yard. You stopped at the cabin frame. You paced the distance to the creek twice. You're calculating, not just looking. He didn't answer immediately. You notice a lot. I notice everything, she said, without any particular pride in it, just fact. I've had to. This was the part he couldn't fully explain later, even to himself. He was a man who'd spent the better part of 2 decades making decisions based on what was practical. Not cold. He wasn't cold exactly, but measured, economical. He had a life that worked because he didn't overreach, didn't overcommit, didn't let himself get pulled into other people's complicated circumstances. And yet, there was something about the way she'd stood in that street, the way she'd asked him not to help her, right up until the moment she didn't, the way she'd told him about her dead husband and the plans that never got off paper without a single note of self-pity in her voice, the way she'd cataloged his movements in the yard with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to see without the one tool everyone else relied on. He thought about Hargrove's face when he'd looked at the creek. He thought about the lumber prices in the valley. He thought about $11 and a mule with a broken saddle. You need a builder, he said. I need a partner, she said. Someone who can do what I can't, in exchange for a share. What share? Equal. She said it without hesitation. You'd be asking me to trust you with everything I have left. I'm not doing that for less than equal. You'd be asking me to build a sawmill through winter with almost no money. Yes. What happens when we run out of what little we have? We figure it out, she said, like people do. He looked at the creek again, the sound of it, underneath the wind, strong and continuous and indifferent to all of them. I'll need to sleep somewhere that isn't a snowdrift, he said. The cabin's cold, but the walls hold. I'll fix the walls. I know you will, she said. He looked at her sideways. You're very sure of yourself for someone who just met me an hour ago. I've been waiting 3 years to find someone worth trusting with this, Evelyn said. I got good at reading people. A pause. I can't afford to make a mistake. Neither can I. Then we're already thinking the same way. The town found out about it the way the town found out about everything. Within the day. By the following morning, it was a piece of comic entertainment they were sharing over coffee and across store counters. The widow and the trapper. Silas Mercer, who most of them knew only as a man who came through twice a year, sold his furs, and kept to himself, had apparently spent every dollar he had to pay off Evelyn Ashcroft's debt and was now living in her crumbling cabin and planning to build a watermill. A mill, said Chet Dobbs, who ran the saloon and had the kind of authority in a small town that comes from being where people drink. That blind woman told him she's going to build a mill, and he just believed her. She had her husband's plans, someone offered. Her dead husband's never built plans, Dobbs said. Difference. It was Mabel Greer from the general store who introduced the marriage angle. Not maliciously. Mabel wasn't malicious so much as thorough. You know the custom, she said. Man pays a woman's debt and moves on to her property. There are those who'd say that's as good as a wedding announcement. This launched a secondary wave of entertainment. By the end of the week, Silas and Evelyn were being referred to as a married couple, in the way small towns did things like that. Half joking, half just making the paperwork match the reality as they understood it. Silas heard about this and said nothing. Evelyn heard about it too. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Let them say whatever they want. It costs us nothing. You don't find it offensive. I find it irrelevant, she said. What they say about us has no bearing on whether this mill gets built. The first real conversation happened 3 days in, after a particularly grueling afternoon in which Silas had spent 6 hours cutting timber in air cold enough to make his hands stop cooperating properly. And Evelyn had spent the same 6 hours pacing the mill site with a knotted rope she used to measure distances. Cross-referencing measurements she'd memorized against the distances she could pace. He came back to the cabin after dark and found her sitting at the table with her hands around a mug of something hot, and she tilted her head toward the sound of him. The timber for the frame, she said. I need to know the exact dimensions of what you cut today. I kept a record. He'd gotten into the habit quickly, writing down each cut on a piece of board with charcoal because they couldn't afford paper to waste. He read her the numbers. She didn't write anything. She just listened and nodded occasionally. You're actually memorizing those, he said. They go with everything else. He sat down across from her. How much do you have in your head? Everything my husband documented. 3 years of modification and refinement on top of that. Corrections to his calculations. He was optimistic about load tolerance, and I think I know why. He had a tendency to trust numbers he wanted to be true rather than numbers that were, and then my own additions. She drank from her mug, the wheel specifications, the gear ratios, the blade alignment, the water intake rate of the creek by season, which I've been measuring by sound for 3 years. By sound. Water changes pitch with volume and speed. I've been recording it in my head. A small pause. You think that's strange? I think I couldn't do it, Silas said. No, she agreed. But you can do things I can't. That's the arrangement. He was quiet for a minute. The fire in the hearth was doing its best. Your husband, he said. Was he good to you? It was a blunt question, and he knew it as he asked it. But he'd found that blunt questions were usually better than careful ones. They got past the practiced answers. Evelyn was still for a moment. He was a kind man, she said. A dreamer. He thought bigger than he could execute. He wasn't practical. He wasn't... She stopped. He wasn't what I needed in the end, but he wasn't cruel. She paused. I don't think you asked that out of kindness. I asked it because I need to know if you're doing this because you want to build something or because you're trying to prove something to someone who's dead. Evelyn set her mug down on the table with a precise, quiet movement. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she said, and I don't think you're in any position to judge someone for what drives them. I'm not judging. I need to know what I'm building for. She thought about it. Both, she said finally. If I'm honest, I want to build this because it's a good idea and it will work, and I've spent 3 years making sure of that. And because... She stopped again. Because he spent 2 years talking about it and never started. And I thought for a long time that was his failure and his alone, and then I realized I was doing the same thing, talking in my head about it, planning without starting. What changed? Hargrove sent his clerk to my door with the debt notice, and I realized that doing nothing was no longer an option. She tilted her head slightly. Sometimes you need someone to take everything away before you're willing to risk what little you have left. Silas looked at the fire. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, I know what we're building for. He stood up. I'm going to repair the eastern wall before it gets colder. The gap at the corner is letting in enough wind to kill the fire. I know, she said. I've been stopping it with rags. I'll fix it properly. I know you will, she said again, and he heard the same quality in it as the first time. Not flattery, not warmth, exactly. Just the plain acknowledgement of someone who had looked at him clearly and made an accurate assessment. It was, he realized, one of the stranger things anyone had ever said to him, and one of the ones that made him feel the most like a person. The work was brutal in a way that was also clarifying. They fell into a rhythm that had nothing romantic about it, nothing soft or convenient. It was the rhythm of people who needed each other to survive and who were both practical enough to prioritize function over comfort. Silas was up before dawn every morning, working by lantern light in temperatures that tested the quality of every joint in his body. He was strong in the particular way of men who've never done a job that didn't require their whole body, but this was different from trapping. Trapping was sustained cold endurance, patience, and stillness. This was sustained physical force, cutting giant pines with a 2-man saw he was using alone, splitting timber, hauling logs on a sled across frozen ground. By the 3rd week, his hands had developed a new kind of callus on top of the existing ones. Evelyn ran the construction from what she called her office, which was the cabin table where she kept her mental plans organized through a system of knotted rope samples, model pieces, and a set of wooden blocks she used to physically work through geometry. Her hands could verify what her mind had calculated. She would call out to him when he came in at midday, specific adjustments, corrections, additions, and he would take them as given. He'd stopped questioning her calculations after the 2nd day, when he'd double-checked one of them with his own measurements and found it was more accurate than his. You measured this distance as 14 feet 2 inches, she said, handing him a rope. I did. Recheck the far end. You're measuring from the wrong stake. He went back out and rechecked. She was right. He came back inside. How did you know? You walked it in 16 steps when you should have walked it in 16 and a half. Your stride is consistent. She tilted her head. I've been calibrating it since the first day. He stared at her. You've been using my walking as a measuring instrument. You have a very consistent stride, she said. You're better than rope. He had no response to this and eventually just went back to work. The town remained entertained. People came by occasionally, under the guise of various errands that brought them near Mill Creek Road, and they would stand at a distance and watch Silas work and shake their heads in the particular way of people who believe they're watching someone else's folly play out. Occasionally, someone called out to him, "Mercer, when you planning to give this up?" He didn't answer. "That woman's got you building on a dream, son. Creek doesn't push enough water for any serious wheel." He kept cutting timber. "She can't even see what you're building her. You know that, right?" Silas put down his axe, turned, and looked at the man who'd said the last thing. The man's name was Roy Pettit, a failed farmer who'd been turned bitter by it in the particular way of men who couldn't accept that the fault was partly theirs. "She can't see it," Silas said, "but she designed every inch of it. What have you built lately, Roy?" Roy had nothing to say to that, and eventually left. That evening, Evelyn heard about the exchange from the neighbor woman who'd been with her at the bank. A woman named Clara, who still came by occasionally with food and opinions, neither of which were always welcome. "Silas told Roy Pettit off," Clara said, with the relish of a woman who liked Roy Pettit less than she let on in public. "In front of 3 people. Evelyn said nothing. "Doesn't that... it's good he's defending you." "He wasn't defending me," Evelyn said. He was defending the project." She paused. "Which is how I'd prefer it." Clara looked at her with an expression that Evelyn obviously couldn't see, but probably would have disagreed with anyway. The crisis with the money came faster than either of them had fully planned for. They'd known it was coming. That wasn't the surprise. The surprise was Hargrove's timing, which Silas came to understand over the following weeks was not accidental. He found out the same way Evelyn found out about most things, through sound. Clara arrived one evening while Silas was still outside, and he heard her voice before she knew he was close. "Another debt, Evelyn. Different terms, but dated before the one you already paid. He says he's found documentation of an earlier loan your husband took that was never properly retired." "How much?" Evelyn said. Her voice was very flat. $84. And he's given you 3 weeks. Silas stood outside and let the cold work at him for a moment. $84. They had 19. He went inside. Clara looked at him the way people look at someone they're glad has arrived to share a problem. "You heard," Evelyn said. "I heard." He sat down at the table. The fire was low. They'd been economical with fuel. "It might be legitimate," he said, because he was a man who tried to be honest with himself even when he didn't want to be. "It's not," Evelyn said. "My husband kept records. I went through every document in this house after he died. There was no outstanding loan at that amount." A pause. "But proving that would take a lawyer, which we can't afford." Silas was quiet. "He wants us to fail before it's done," he said. "He wants the property," Evelyn said, "and the creek." A very short pause. "He's known about the mill plan for years. My husband talked about it publicly, often. Hargrove's been waiting. For you to run out of money. For me to run out of everything." Silas looked at his hands on the table. He thought about the rifle. The Whitmore rifle that had been with him for 11 years, that had fed him and kept him alive and functioned in conditions that would have destroyed most firearms. It was worth... He knew what it was worth. He'd been offered for it before. He thought about saying what he was thinking. He didn't. "I'll figure out the money," he said. "Give me 2 days." "Silas?" 2 days. He rode Cobb into Black Ridge alone the next morning. He walked into Dunmore's trading post. "The Whitmore," he said. Dunmore looked up from his ledger, looked at the rifle, looked at Silas. "Mercer? You sure? You've offered me 110 twice. That offer still stand." Dunmore was quiet for a moment. "Man who sells his rifle in winter. I have a knife," Silas said. "And I'll be inside for a while." He set the rifle on the counter. "Is the offer still standing?" Dunmore looked at it. He was a trader, but he wasn't a cruel man. 100, he said. Rifle market dropped. Silas looked at him. 105, Dunmore said. "That's what I can do." Silas took the money. He stood at the counter for a moment after, the way a man stands when he's put something down he thought he'd carry longer. He walked back out into the cold. He paid Hargrove's claimed debt that afternoon, in the same way he'd paid the first one, cash on the counter, not quite meeting Hargrove's eyes because he didn't trust what his face might do. Walking back out of the bank, he ran into Roy Pettit again. "Still at it," Roy said, and it wasn't really a question. "Still at it," Silas agreed and kept walking. He got back to the homestead after dark. Evelyn was at the table. She heard the difference in his step before he sat down, he realized later. She'd already built his walk into her mental instruments. She knew. "You sold something," she said. "It's handled." "What did you sell?" He didn't answer. She was quiet for a long moment. "I'll pay you back for that too," she said. "I know you will," he said. He didn't sleep well that night. The rifle's absence was a specific kind of wrong. Not regret exactly, but the absence of something so familiar it had become structural, like a step that isn't there when you expect it. He lay on his bunk in the dark, listening to the creek. It did run strong. He'd known that for a while, known Evelyn was right. You could hear the real force of it on cold nights when the other sounds dropped away. A deep, consistent push that spoke to volume and gradient both. He thought about the wheel, about the gear train Evelyn had described to him, piece by piece, until he could see it as clearly as she'd mapped it. About the blade assembly, about the product that would come out the other end. Clean lumber, consistent dimensions, at a price that would make every merchant in the valley come to them instead of paying twice as much for hauled timber. He thought about Hargrove's face on the first day, the look of a man revising a plan. He understood now why Hargrove wanted this land, not just as property, as the site of the only mill for 100 miles. If Hargrove controlled the mill, he controlled the lumber. If he controlled the lumber, he controlled the building, which meant he controlled the expansion of every homestead, every business, every structure in the valley for the next 20 years. Evelyn had worked this out years before Silas had arrived. The plan she'd built in the dark, alone, in a cabin she couldn't leave enough to run without falling, was bigger than a sawmill. It was a permanent structural change to how the entire valley worked. He stared at the ceiling and let that settle. Then he got up, because lying in the dark brooding never helped anything, and went to check the cabin's east wall, which had been giving him trouble for a week. By the end of December, the frame of the mill was standing. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the kind of structure anyone was going to look at and say what craftsmanship. It was heavy, solid, and practical in the way things are when they're built by someone working alone in the cold without quite enough materials. But the main posts were sound, the crossbeams were true, and when Silas stood back and looked at it with his hands on his hips in the watery winter light, he felt the particular satisfaction of looking at something real that hadn't existed before. Evelyn stood beside him. She put one hand on the main post and ran it slowly upward, reading the grain and the finish and the joins the way other people read words on a page. "It's good," she said. "It's a start." "The joins on the northern crossbeam. You switched to a mortise there instead of what I specified." He was briefly impressed she could feel that. "The angles weren't going to hold with the original plan. I adapted. And it's stronger." "It should be." She kept her hand on the post for a moment longer, then she nodded, once, like she was agreeing to something only she'd been asked. 6 weeks, she said. "Maybe 8, if the weather holds enough to work." "Weather never holds." "Then 10 weeks, she said. "We'll finish in 10 weeks regardless." He looked at the frame against the winter sky. "All right," he said. They went back to work. The frame stood through the first serious storm of January like it had always been there. Silas had built it into a natural break in the tree line, which cut the worst of the wind, and he'd driven the corner posts 18 inches deeper than the original plans called for because the ground at the mill site had a softness to it that he didn't trust. Evelyn had questioned the extra depth when he told her, not doubting him, just wanting to understand. And when he explained it, she'd gone quiet in the way she did when she was filing something away. "If the ground shifts in spring thaw," she said, "it will. Everywhere does. We need the posts anchored below the frost line, or we'll be re-leveling the whole platform in March." "My husband's notes didn't account for that." "Your husband's notes were written by someone who hadn't sunk posts in this specific ground." She considered this. "Add 6 inches to the northwest post, too. The creek side has more moisture. It'll move more." He added 8, because she was right that the creek side would move and he'd rather overbuild than fix it later. The storm hit on a Wednesday night and blew hard for 2 days. Silas spent most of it in the cabin doing the finish work he could do indoors, cutting gear teeth into wooden blanks, rough shaping the smaller mechanical components. things that required precise handwork and decent light and shelter from wind. Evelyn sat at the table across from him, working with her wooden blocks and her rope models, occasionally asking him to read measurements back to her, or to describe the feel of a surface he'd cut. The tooth depth on that gear, she said, on the second afternoon of the storm. Run your thumbnail along the cut. He did. What am I telling you? How consistent it is. Irregular depth means the gear will bind. Your thumbnail will catch if there are variations. He ran it again, more carefully. There's one tooth about 2/3 around that's maybe a shade shallow. Fix it before you move on. I was going to. I know, she said. I'm telling you anyway. He looked up at her. You do that. Tell you things you already know? Yes. She didn't apologize for it. I can't see what you're doing. Verbal confirmation is how I keep track of where we are in the process. I understand that. I'm not complaining. You said it like a complaint. I said it like an observation. He went back to the gear tooth. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Is there? Yes. Another pause. The wind hit the cabin wall and found the places it could get through. Silas had sealed most of them, but there were always more. I'll try to explain when I need confirmation versus when I actually doubt you, Evelyn said. It cost her something to say it. Not much, but he could hear the slight stiffness. She wasn't used to adjusting. I'll tell you when something sounds like a complaint that isn't, he said. That was as close as they came, in those early weeks, to anything you could call a negotiation about how they worked together. Not a warm conversation. Not a breakthrough. Just two people in a storm, trying to figure out the rules of sharing space without collision. The storm passed Thursday night. Friday morning, Silas went out and checked the frame. All 4 posts were holding exactly where he'd put them. He didn't say anything about it when he came back in, but Evelyn, who'd heard him walk out and walk back and had apparently been calibrating his footstep patterns long enough to read something in the rhythm, said, It held. It held, he confirmed. She made a small sound that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the neighborhood. They went back to work. The problem with January, beyond the cold and the wind and the way the light quit at 4 in the afternoon, was money, or rather the absence of it. Silas had $11 left after Hargrove's debt, which had become $9 after they'd needed to replace a broken saw blade that couldn't be fixed, which was now hovering just above 7 as they ate through their supplies in the methodical way of people who know they have to make things last. Evelyn kept the household accounts in her head, the same way she kept the mill plans, precisely, without apparent effort, in a way that was slightly unnerving to someone who used pen and paper for that kind of thing. We have enough salt pork for 3 weeks at current consumption, she said one evening, while Silas was sharpening tools by the fire. Cornmeal for about the same. If we reduce portions, 5 weeks. I can hunt. You sold your rifle. He kept sharpening. I have a knife. Silas. There are snares. I can set snares. She was quiet for a moment. What can you get with snares in January? Rabbit. Grouse if I'm patient. Enough. The time it takes you to check snares is time you're not working on the mill. I know that. Is there another way? He thought about it. Dunmore sometimes needs hauling work done. I could offer a day's labor in exchange for supplies. That's also time. Everything is time, he said, which was blunter than he meant it, but wasn't wrong. Evelyn rested her hands flat on the table, which he'd noticed she did when she was thinking through a problem she didn't immediately see the solution to. Something about the physical contact with the surface seemed to help her think. Clara's husband, she said finally, Tom Greer. He has timber he needs cut, and he can't afford to hire proper help. He offered me labor exchange last fall, and I couldn't take it. You could now. You could, on my behalf. A day's cutting for a week's supplies. She paused. He might also spread the word that we need occasional trade work. There are homesteaders farther up the valley who bring their timber to Black Ridge for milling and pay Hargrove's price for the lumber that comes back. They'd pay less for direct work. Silas looked at her. She'd thought this through fast, faster than him, which he was beginning to accept as just how things were. You've been planning contingencies, he said. Since before you arrived, she said. I had more of them when I thought I'd be doing this alone. How many fall apart because there's 2 of us? Most of them, she said. You need more food than I budgeted for. You consume 3 times what I do. I'm 3 times bigger than you. Roughly, Yes. I didn't have an accurate reference point. A slight pause. I've recalculated. He almost smiled. He caught it before it got anywhere. All right, I'll talk to Tom Greer tomorrow. The arrangement with Tom Greer turned out to be less straightforward than either of them had hoped. Not because Tom was difficult. He was a decent enough man, overworked and underfunded, like most of the homesteaders in the valley, but because Tom's wife Ellen had opinions about the whole Ashcroft situation that she hadn't been asked for and offered anyway. Silas arrived at the Greer homestead and was halfway through explaining the trade when Ellen came out of the house wiping her hands on her apron with the energy of a woman who'd been waiting for an opportunity. "You're the one building Evelyn's mill," she said. "Working on it? Yes. People say she's got you doing it all while she sits inside." Silas considered several responses and chose the shortest. "People say a lot of things." "Well, is it true? She runs the engineering. I run the construction. That's a partnership, not her sitting inside." Ellen Greer looked at him with the expression of a woman deciding whether to believe this. "My Clara says she seems sharper than she lets on." Clara's right. But the mill's a crazy idea. Everyone says so. "Everyone said a lot of things about a lot of things that turned out to be wrong," Silas said. "You have timber that needs cutting, Mrs. Greer. I need supplies. That seems like a simpler topic." Tom Greer, who had the look of a man married to someone who conducted most of his negotiations for him, gave Silas an apologetic glance, and they worked out the terms without further editorial. A full day's cutting, 12 to 15 logs, rough-shaped, for a 30-pound sack of cornmeal, 10 pounds of salt pork, and a jug of rendered lard that would make the cabin smell terrible but would keep the cold out of their bones. He came back to the homestead that evening with the supplies loaded on cob and aching in both shoulders from the cutting. Evelyn heard him come in and heard the sound of the sacks being set down. "Tom Greer's timber," she said. "Done." "How much did Ellen talk?" He paused. "How did you know?" "Because Ellen Greer talks at every opportunity, and Tom Greer lets her because it's easier." She moved to help with the supplies, her hands finding the sacks with the particular efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate a space completely. "What did she say?" "That everyone thinks the mill is a crazy idea." "She's not wrong that everyone thinks it." "No." He sat down heavily. His shoulders needed at least an hour before he'd be useful again. "She also said people think you're sitting inside while I do the work." Evelyn's hand stilled on the sack for just a moment. Then she kept moving. "I know what people think." "It bothers you." "Of course it bothers me." She said it without drama, the way she said most things. "I designed every component of that mill from memory. I've done every calculation twice, and most of them 3 times. I measure the creek's water volume every morning by sound, and I've been doing it for 3 years. She set the cornmeal on the shelf with a controlled precision that suggested she was moderating her own energy. And the only thing people can see is that I'm not outside swinging an axe. So that's the conclusion they reach. "They'll see different when it's running," Silas said. "Will they?" Not a question. More like a challenge to a comfortable assumption. He thought about it honestly. "Some will. And the rest? The rest will give the credit to whoever they were already willing to give it to," he said. "That's how people work." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a more honest answer than I expected. I try not to tell people what they want to hear." "I know," she said. "That's one of the more useful things about you." He didn't quite know what to do with that, so he said nothing, and after a moment she went back to her work at the table and he sat by the fire and let his shoulders recover. The second week of January brought a brief warmth. Not real warmth, but a relative warmth, the kind of 6-day break in deep winter that tempts people into thinking the worst is past and that always, always passes. Silas used it without illusions. He worked from before light to after dark, getting the mill's lower platform framed and boarded, getting the water intake channel roughed in, starting the base structure for the wheel housing. Evelyn came out to the site for the first time on the 3rd day of the warm spell. She'd been out there before, in the early days, pacing distances and orienting herself. But this was different. The frame was up now, the platform was taking shape, and she moved through it differently. Her hands went to the posts and the beams and the boarding, reading the structure the way a person reads a room they know in the dark. Silas watched her from where he was working on the wheel housing and said nothing. She stopped at the water intake channel and crouched down, putting both hands in the cut earth, feeling the dimensions and the angle. The grade's shallower than I specified, she said, by half an inch over 15 feet. I'll get more volume through if I shallow it slightly at this point. It smooths the flow before the wheel. Steeper grade creates turbulence. She felt the angle again. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about this for 2 months. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. Where did you learn hydraulics? I didn't, specifically. I learned how water moves in creek beds from 30 years of crossing them in bad conditions. Same principles, different scale. My husband had books on hydraulic engineering, Evelyn said. He read them very carefully and understood them very poorly. A pause. You have no books and understand it better. Books help if you also have the experience to know when the book is wrong, he said. She moved to the wheel housing base and put her hands on the framing. This is good, she said. And she meant the framing, but she said it in the same tone she'd used when she said he understood hydraulics better than her husband had from books. And there was something in that overlap that he chose not to examine too closely. The wheel itself, she said. When are you starting it? 2 weeks, maybe. I need the housing walls up first, and the bearing mounts need to be set precisely, or the whole thing runs wrong. The bearing mounts are the most critical single element in the design. I know that. I want to be there when you set them. I'd expect you to be. She turned toward him. I want to be physically present and involved, not standing near the perimeter. I want to set the second mount myself. He looked at her. The practicalities ran through his mind quickly. The physical risk, the precision required, the conditions they'd be working in. He didn't say any of that. All right, he said. I'll rig the measurement guide so you can feel the alignment. I already know how I do it, she said. I've been planning it. Of course you have, he said, and this time he didn't catch the edge of a smile quite fast enough. Evelyn, who couldn't see it, seemed to hear something in his voice. Was that almost a smile, Mercer? No. It sounded like one. You're calibrating wrong. My calibration, she said, with a precision that was almost its own kind of smile, is never wrong. And she turned and made her way back toward the mill frame with her hands finding each post as she passed, reading the structure, committing it to the permanent map she kept of everything. Silas watched her go and thought, not for the first time, that she was the most unusual person he'd encountered in 30-some years of encountering people in difficult places. Not unusual in the way that required managing or explaining. Unusual in the way that made you realize you'd been measuring everyone by a set of standards that were wrong. And here was the correct standard, and it was harder and more specific and considerably more demanding. He went back to the wheel housing. The warm spell ended on the 6th day, as warm spells always did, with a north wind that dropped the temperature back to brutal and coated everything in a new layer of ice that made the site hazardous. Silas spent a morning chipping ice off the platform before he could work safely and developed a language for this activity that Evelyn, in the cabin, diplomatically didn't comment on. The town sent its next wave of skepticism in the form of visitors. They came in pairs usually, which was how people in small towns approached things they weren't sure about. A lone felt too exposed, but a crowd felt like a statement. 2 or 3 men, or 2 women, stopping at the edge of the property on some invented errand and watching the construction from a careful distance. Silas noticed them and didn't engage. Evelyn knew they were there from the sound of horses stopping at the road, or the particular silence that meant people were watching. The Dobbses, she said one afternoon, recognizing, he assumed, the sound of a particular horse. 2 of them, yes. What are they doing? Standing, Silas said, looking. Let them. A pause. They'll be buying our lumber in 8 months. That confident. Chet Dobbs extended his saloon twice in the last 3 years. He needs lumber, every expansion. He's been paying Hargrove's transport price for it. She kept working with her rope model. When we're running, we'll offer him a price that saves him 30%. He'll come. And if he doesn't? The man values money over principles, Evelyn said. He'll come. Silas thought about Chet Dobbs standing at the edge of the property watching them like they were a public entertainment. He thought about Dobbs coming to them later, checkbook in hand, having forgotten the standing and the watching. You've been planning the business side of this as long as the mill itself, he said. Longer, Evelyn said. The business side is why the mill exists. I'm not building a machine. I'm building a business that controls the material supply of this entire valley. He looked at her. What? She said, hearing the pause. Nothing. You just don't sound like a widow trying to save her property. No, she agreed. I sound like someone who spent 3 years in this cabin figuring out how to make sure no man like Hargrove can ever threaten what's mine again. She found the piece she'd been looking for in her rope model and adjusted it. The mill is the first step. What comes after is the point. He turned this over in his mind for a long time that evening, while the temperature outside dropped to the kind of cold that made the cabin walls contract and the firework twice as hard. He thought about the size of what she was actually doing. Not just the mill, not just the debt, but the systematic restructuring of an economic dependence that had made her and everyone like her vulnerable to men like Hargrove. Thought about the fact that she'd been building this plan in complete darkness, literally, with no resources and no allies and no guarantee of anything. He thought about the rifle he'd sold and felt, for the first time, that it had been worth precisely what he'd traded it for. He didn't say any of this. He was not, by nature or practice, a man who narrated his own realizations. But when he banked the fire that night, and she said, from her side of the cabin, "Silas, thank you for the intake channel adjustment. The flow calculations are better with your grade," he said. "You're welcome," and meant it in a way that covered more ground than the words did. In the last week of January, he started on the water wheel itself. The wheel was 8 feet in diameter, smaller than the largest frontier mills, but sized precisely for the volume and speed of Mill Creek's flow, which Evelyn had calculated to within a margin that he was increasingly certain was tighter than most engineers could manage with instruments. He'd been collecting the timber for the spokes and the rim sections for weeks, setting pieces aside as he cut, choosing for grain and density with the same care he'd use for anything that was going to take sustained force in all weather. He laid the first spoke on the platform and sighted down its length. Straight. Good. He picked up the second and heard, behind him, Evelyn step out of the cabin. "Starting the wheel," she said. "First 2 spokes." She came across the yard with her hand trailing the cabin wall until she reached the platform edge, and then she stepped up carefully, finding the surface with each foot before she committed her weight. Silas watched this without offering a hand. He'd learned, over the past weeks, that she didn't want a hand unless she asked for one, and she had a precise sense of when the terrain justified it and when it didn't. She came to where the first spoke lay on the platform and crouched beside it, running both hands along the wood from end to end. "White pine," she said. "Mostly. I used fir for the load-bearing sections." She found where the pine transitioned to fir by touch, a change in grain that his own hands could barely detect, and pressed her fingertips against the joint. "Did you season this enough?" "As much as I could with the time we have. Another month would be better." "What happens if it moves?" "It'll move," he said. "All wood moves. I've built the mounting tolerances to allow for it." She kept her hands on the spoke. "If it moves past the tolerance, then we'll refit in spring, but I don't think it will." She stood up. "Neither do I," she said. "Otherwise I'd have said more about it." He picked up the second spoke and she stayed on the platform while he worked, her head turning at each sound, tracking the movements of the construction with that peculiar attention of hers that had stopped feeling strange to him weeks ago and now felt simply like her. Like the way she was. The cold came back hard that night, and the wheel's first 2 spokes stayed on the platform under a canvas tarp, waiting for the next day's work. Silas came inside and found Evelyn already at the table, working. "How many weeks to the wheel?" she asked. 3, maybe, if the cold stays workable." "It won't." "No," he agreed. 4 then. Maybe 5. She made a sound that wasn't agreement but wasn't argument either, just acknowledgement. "After the wheel," he said. "What's the hardest part?" "The axle mount," she said, without hesitation. "That's where everything can go wrong. The axle has to be perfectly level and perfectly centered, or the whole gear train is wrong and none of the power transfers correctly." She paused. "That's also the heaviest lift. The main axle assembly will weigh close to 1,000 pounds when it's all together." "We'll need a rig." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the rig. The geometry is complicated because the wheel housing constrains our approach angles. Tell me what you have." And she did, carefully, specifically, with the same meticulous depth she brought to everything. and Silas listened and occasionally interrupted with practical questions about load angles and rigging points, and she answered each one. And between the two of them, in a cold cabin on a January night with the wind working at the walls, they designed a lifting rig for a 1,000-pound axle that neither of them had the equipment to build yet and wouldn't need for 2 months. But they designed it, together, in the dark. That was, he thought, what they did best. The wheel took 5 weeks instead of 4, because February had opinions about the matter. It came in with an ice storm that coated every surface on the mill site in a 1/4 inch of clear ice that made the platform as dangerous as a frozen pond and the timber impossible to handle without losing your grip at the worst possible moment. Silas spent 2 full days doing nothing but chipping and salting surfaces just to make the site safe to stand on, work that accomplished nothing visible, and cost him 48 hours he could feel ticking away every time he looked at the half-assembled wheel structure under its canvas. The wheel was taking shape, though. 8 spokes radiating from the hub he'd built from laminated fir, the rim sections fitted between them in a curve that was, so far, true. He checked it with a level every morning before he started work and every evening before he covered it. Evelyn asked him about the level readings each time, and each time he told her, and each time she was quiet for exactly long enough to run whatever calculation she was running, and then either said nothing or said, adjust the eastern rim section by 1/8 of an inch, or something equally specific, which he then did. You're using me as your level, he said one morning. I'm using your level as my level through you, she corrected. There's a difference. Not much of one. Enough of one, she said. Hand me the hub model. He handed her the wooden hub replica she'd built at 1/4 scale from scraps, which she used to physically work through assembly problems her hands could solve faster than her mind could calculate. She turned it slowly in both hands, feeling the spoke joints. The load will be uneven at startup, she said. First water contact puts force on the low blades before the wheel builds speed. The hub needs to absorb that. I've built the lamination for impact load. How many layers? 7. Alternating grain direction. She kept turning the model. My husband's plans called for 5. Your husband's plans were good plans, Silas said carefully, but this creek has more energy than he probably measured. 7 is safer. She set the model down and was quiet for a moment. Not upset. He'd learned the difference between her silences by now. This one was the silence of someone checking their own assumptions against new information. What made you decide 7 specifically? The volume calculation you gave me in January, the one corrected for seasonal minimum flow. He picked up his mug. At that flow rate, startup torque on the hub is higher than what 5 layers handles safely over time. I've seen similar setups fail at 5. Never at 7. You've seen water mill hubs fail. I've seen a grinding mill in the lower valley lose a hub after 2 seasons. Owner used 5-layer laminate. I helped him rebuild it. He drank. Used 7 that time. Evelyn absorbed this. You never mentioned that. You never asked about hub construction specifically. I should have. You'd have gotten there, he said. You get to everything eventually. She tilted her head slightly in the way that meant she was deciding whether something was a compliment or not. Then she picked up her hub model again and went back to turning it, and the conversation folded itself into the morning's work, which was how most of their conversations ended, not with a conclusion, but with a return to the task, which was itself a kind of conclusion. The ice storm broke on the 9th of February, and Silas went back to the wheel with a focus that bordered on single-minded. The blade paddles were the last major component, 16 of them fitted into the rim sections, each one angled to catch the water at precisely the degree Evelyn had calculated for maximum torque transfer. He'd cut the paddles weeks ago, storing them in the cabin to keep them dry, and now he fitted them one by one with the careful, repetitive work that required more patience than strength. Evelyn came out on the second afternoon of paddle installation. She didn't come to check on him. She came because she'd run out of indoor work she could do without measurements from the site. And sitting in the cabin with nothing constructive to do was not something she tolerated well. He'd figured this out around week 3. She'd rather be cold and useful than warm and idle. She found the wheel structure by following the platform edge and stood beside it with one hand on the rim. 14 paddles, she said. How do you know? I counted your footsteps and your installation sounds. Each paddle takes roughly the same number of movements. A brief pause. 14 so far. 15, he said. You missed one while you were walking out here. She accepted this without embarrassment. 2 to go. 2 to go. She put her other hand on the structure and felt the angle of the nearest paddle, running her thumb along the leading edge. This angle is right, she said. How's your consistency across the set? Good. Some variation, no more than a degree either way on any of them. A degree will cost us efficiency. A degree less than perfect is what you get when one person installs 16 paddles over 2 days in February, he said. The variation is within the tolerance you built into the design. A short pause. You know my tolerances. I've been building to them for 2 months. She took her hands off the wheel and crossed them in front of her, which was something she did when she was standing still in the cold, not quite hugging herself, more like an unconscious structural settling. I'm going to be difficult about the axle mount, she said. I know. I mean more difficult than I've been about other things. I know that too. It needs to be right the first time. We can't adjust a 1,000-pound axle after it's set. If we get it wrong, we'll get it right, Silas said. You don't know that. No, he agreed. But I know what we've gotten right so far and how we did it, and if we do it the same way, we'll get the axle right too. He picked up the 16th paddle. You design it, I build it. We check everything twice, and then we do it. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the wind, which had been resting, made a single long pass through the tree line and came out the other side quieter than it went in. All right, she said. He fitted the last paddle. The axle rig took 10 days to design properly and another 6 to build, and it was ugly. There was no other word for it. It was a structure of salvaged timber and rope and iron hardware that Silas had traded 2 days of labor to a blacksmith in Black Ridge for, and it looked like something built under pressure by someone with limited materials, which was exactly what it was. But Evelyn had worked through the load geometry so many times and in so many configurations that when Silas actually built it to her specifications, the ugly structure had a mechanical precision inside it that the exterior didn't suggest. He tested it with logs before he committed to using it on the axle. Rigged the rig over a 400-pound pine log and hoisted it, checking every joint and rope point under load. The rig held. He did it again with 2 logs. Tell me what you're hearing, Evelyn said from the platform edge, where she'd been standing for an hour. Holding clean, no creaking in the main join, which is what I was worried about. And the rope tension at the secondary block. Even. Better than I expected. It'll be different with the axle. Different weight distribution, different center of gravity. I know, but this tells me the frame is sound. He lowered the logs back to the platform. We're ready. She turned her face slightly away from him in a gesture he'd come to recognize as her version of looking at something carefully. When? Tomorrow morning, early. I want good light and I want it done before afternoon because I don't trust the weather past noon. She nodded once. She'd been doing that more lately. The single nod, like a period at the end of a sentence. He'd stopped noticing it consciously and started noticing only when it wasn't there. That night, neither of them slept particularly well. He could tell by the sounds from her side of the cabin, the slight shift of her bunk, the pauses in her breathing that meant wakefulness. And she could probably tell the same about him because she didn't remark on it, and she remarked on most things. He got up an hour before dawn and built the fire up and put water on, and when she came to the table, she already knew it was the last day before they'd know whether the mill could actually become what they'd been building it to be, because the axle was the point where all the calculation in the world had to prove itself in iron and wood and moving water or admit it couldn't. Eat something, she said. I was going to. I know. I'm telling you anyway. She sat down. Today is going to be hard work. Yes. And if something goes wrong with the rig, we stop and reassess. I mean, if something goes wrong fast, with the load moving. She found her mug. You'll need to get clear. He looked at her. So will you. I'll be on the platform. I know that platform. I can move fast on it. She drank. You'll be under the load. You need to know where your exits are before we start. He hadn't expected this. Not the content. He'd thought about his own safety. He wasn't a fool. But that she'd said it, that she'd brought it to the table. I know where I'm getting out, he said. Tell me. Northwest corner of the rig gives me clear ground away from the wheel housing. If the rig fails east, I go northwest. If it fails at the block, I go flat to the platform and away from the swing. She listened to this and said nothing for a moment. Then, what if it fails straight down? Then it falls on whatever it's going to fall on, and I try to be somewhere else. That's not a plan. That's what you have when the alternative is it actually falling straight down, he said. We build the rig so that doesn't happen. She drank her coffee. He could see in her hands, the way she was holding the mug, a slight extra tension, that she was more worried than she'd said, and had said more than she'd intended to, and wasn't going to say anything else about it. We'll do it right, he said, which was not a promise, and they both knew it, but it was the most honest thing he could offer. Yes, she said, we will. The main axle was a piece of work by itself. It was iron-sheathed hardwood, a design Evelyn had developed from her husband's original notes and substantially reinforced in the load-bearing sections, and they'd gotten it cast and fitted over 2 separate trips to the blacksmith at a cost that had used the last of their money down to a few dollars. It lay on the platform waiting for them when they came out in the early morning light, dull gray iron in the blue-white of a February dawn, longer than Silas was tall and heavier than anything either of them had moved alone. They spent the first hour doing nothing but preparations. Silas checked every joint in the rig twice, then checked the rope at every load point. He moved through it methodically, without hurrying, and Evelyn stood at the platform's edge and listened to him move and occasionally asked him to tell her what he was checking and why. Not because she doubted him, but because she needed the work to be in her head as well as in his hands. Secondary block, he said. Rope's good. Hemp's stiff in the cold, but not frozen. Flex it before you load it. Already done. Main joint at the east leg. Sound. I put in an extra iron pin 2 days ago. It'll hold. You didn't tell me about the pin. I'm telling you now. Silas. I made the call. It was the right call. I should have told you. A pause. I'll tell you sooner next time. She didn't say anything else about it. They moved to the axle. Getting the axle into the rig's lifting cradle was itself an hour of grinding, careful work. Rolling it on log sections, shifting the weight in increments, getting it exactly positioned so the cradle would hold it level when they lifted. Silas's hands were bleeding from the cold and the iron before they were halfway done. Not badly, just the kind of split-skin cold damage that was too minor to stop for and too persistent to ignore. He didn't mention it. Evelyn, working the rope on the secondary block while he handled the axle directly, felt the change in the rope's behavior when the weight shifted wrong and called it before he saw it. Left side's high, she said, and he looked and she was right, and they shifted it, and it settled level. How did you feel that? He said. The rope told me. Weight distribution changes how rope behaves under tension. Left side high makes the secondary block pull at an angle. I felt the angle change. He looked at the rope in her hands. She was holding it with both hands about shoulder width apart, and she'd apparently been reading load information out of it, the way a fisherman reads what's on the other end of a line. You've been doing that all morning, he said. Since we started, she agreed. I should have mentioned it. You should have. I'll tell you sooner next time, she said, and there was no particular inflection on it, but he heard it as what it was, polite. The same thing he'd said to her 10 minutes ago, about the iron pin, and he went back to the axle and didn't say anything about it either. They lifted it in 3 stages. The rig had 2 block systems, and Silas worked the main hoist while Evelyn managed the secondary line that kept the axle from swinging. The first stage took the weight off the platform, and both of them felt the rig settle into the load. A single collective holding of breath as the timbers took the 1,000 pounds and either held or didn't. And it held. Good, Silas said very quietly. Keep going, Evelyn said. Her voice was completely level. Her hands were white on the rope. The second stage brought it to height. The axle hung in the rig 6 feet off the platform, turning almost imperceptibly in the cold air, and Silas locked the main hoist and went to the bearing mounts on the wheel housing wall, checking them one more time, and came back. Ready for final position, he said. I'm coming in, Evelyn said. Evelyn, I told you I was setting the second mount myself. We discussed it. I know the position, I know the measurement, and I know what to feel for when it's correct. She was already moving, one hand on the rig frame, finding her way to the mount position on her side of the wheel housing. You handle the primary mount. I'll take the secondary. We lower it together on a count. He looked at her on the far side of the rig. her hands on the housing wall, finding the mount bracket by touch. The axle hung between them, 1,000 pounds of iron and wood waiting for a direction. He checked his own mount bracket, looked at hers, looked at the axle. "On 3, he said. "Then we lower slow, 1 inch at a time." "I understand slow," she said. "I know. I'm reminding myself." A pause, something in that pause that he didn't have words for and didn't try to find them. "1, he said. 2, 3. They lowered it. 1 inch at a time, with Silas calling each inch and Evelyn reading the seating of her mount bracket with both hands, her fingers on the iron fitting, feeling for the alignment that would tell her the axle was coming in true. "Left," she said when they were halfway down. "Half an inch left." He shifted his side. "Better?" "Yes, keep coming." 10 minutes of this. Maybe 15. The cold stopped being relevant. Everything outside the axle and the brackets and the communication between them stopped being relevant. He called the inches and she called the corrections, and they brought it down together in the particular silence of two people concentrating on the same thing so hard that they stopped being separate. The axle seated in both mounts with a sound like the whole structure letting out a breath. Silas checked his mount. Set. True. "Your side," he said. Evelyn's hands were moving over the bracket and the axle end, checking the fit and the alignment with her fingers. She didn't answer immediately. He waited. "Set," she said. And then, after a half-second, "True." He let out a breath he'd been holding for approximately 15 minutes. That was when the rig failed. Not catastrophically. Not the way he'd told her he planned for. Not the straight-down collapse he'd said he couldn't plan for. The main joint on the east leg, the one he'd pinned and checked and rechecked, separated at the secondary bolt with a sound like a rifle shot, and the rig lurched hard to the right. The released tension whipping the main rope sideways, the heavy block swinging on a fast arc directly toward Silas's head. He saw it coming. He didn't quite have time to get completely clear. He got his shoulder into the swing instead of his skull, which was the difference between unconscious and merely hurt, and the impact knocked him sideways into the wheel housing wall and then down to the platform. He heard Evelyn. She had the rope. She'd kept the secondary line when the rig failed, by instinct or training, or simply because her hands didn't let go of things. And she was holding the partial load of the collapsing rig with both arms wrapped around the line and her back against the wheel housing wall for leverage. It wasn't the full 1,000 pounds. The axle had seated and was carrying most of its own weight now. But the dead load of the rig components on the failed rope was enough that her hands were being cut through her gloves, and she was making no sound about it at all, just holding. Silas got up. He registered the shoulder later. He crossed the platform and grabbed the rope below her hands and took the load off her. "Let go," he said. She didn't immediately. Her hands had locked. "Evelyn, I have it. Let go." Slowly, her hands opened. He secured the rope to the housing wall with 2 half hitches and looked at the rig. The east leg had folded, but the rest had held, and the axle was sitting in its mounts undisturbed, as though the whole crisis had happened around it while it sat still. He looked at Evelyn's hands. Both palms were cut through the gloves, rope burn and pressure cuts, blood on the leather. Not deep, not dangerous. But her hands were her instruments, and they were hurt, and his stomach did something he didn't let reach his face. "You held the line," he said. "The axle was seated," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something. He could hear that. "I wasn't letting anything disturb it." "Your hands, they're cut." "I know." She turned away from him and toward the axle, as if she needed to check it herself even now. One bleeding hand went to the axle end, checking the seating of the mount. "Is your shoulder?" "Fine." "That sounded like the block hit you." "It did. My shoulder's fine." "It's not fine," she said, "but we'll deal with it inside." She kept her hand on the axle, and he understood she was checking what they'd built, making sure the crisis had left it whole, and so he didn't try to move her toward the cabin yet. He let her check. "It held," he said. "Both mounts." The axle's true. Her hand was still on the axle. He watched her process that. Watched her run both cut hands over the assembly, checking the fit and the level and the alignment that they'd spent 5 minutes of perfect, painful work to achieve. "Yes," she said finally. Her voice had changed slightly. "Yes, it held." The wind came through the tree line again, and the mill frame stood around them, and the creek ran underneath everything with the same sound it always made. The sound she'd been listening to for 3 years, measuring it, planning by it, building an entire future on the mathematics of its persistence. He looked at her cut hands, and the axle sitting true in its mounts, and the wheel waiting at the end of the shaft for the water to be let in. "Come inside, he said. "I'll look at your hands." She took one more moment, just one, with her fingers on the axle. Then she nodded. They walked back to the cabin through the February cold, both of them moving carefully, both of them carrying something they weren't saying yet. The mill standing behind them in the afternoon light like a thing that had decided, on its own, to survive. He cleaned her hands that evening with water he'd heated over the fire, and strips of cloth torn from a spare shirt, and she let him do it without argument, which told him more about how much her hands hurt than anything she said. She said very little. She sat at the table with both hands open on the surface, palms up, and he worked carefully at the rope cuts, which were cleaner than they looked, mostly, and the pressure damage across both palms where she'd locked around the line and held. "This one's deeper than the rest," he said, about a cut across the base of her right thumb. "I know, I can feel the difference. It should be bound tight for a few days. Then bind it tight." A pause. "Will it affect the work?" He looked at her hands, at the cuts and the swelling already developing across both palms. He thought about all the work her hands did. The measuring, the model building, the rope calibrations, the 1,000 small tactile readings she ran on everything. "Yes," he said, "for a few days." She didn't respond immediately. He kept working. "Your shoulder," she said. "It'll be sore. Sore or damaged." He rolled it experimentally, which hurt in a dull, deep way that wasn't the sharp pain of something broken. "Sore. The block hit the muscle, not the joint." "Can you work tomorrow?" "Yes." Honestly. Honestly, yes. Slower than usual, but yes. She accepted this. He finished binding her right hand and started on the left. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, and the creak made its sound under everything, consistent and indifferent. "The rig joint," Evelyn said. "The east leg. Failed at the secondary bolt. I checked that bolt twice." "I know you did." "It was cold stressed. The iron got brittle overnight and I didn't account for that properly." He kept his attention on her left palm. "I should have added a third bolt." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have asked about the cold tolerance of the iron fittings. I didn't think to." "Neither did us is better than one of us," he said. "It's still a failure." "Yes," he said. "It is. The axle's set and the mill is intact, and we'll rebuild the rig properly in the spring for maintenance work. But the bolt failure was a mistake, and we should know why it happened so it doesn't happen again." She turned this over. He could always tell when she was doing that, some quality of stillness that was different from her other stillnesses. "My husband," she said, "when something went wrong, he always found a reason it wasn't his fault, not maliciously. He just couldn't stand the weight of it." A pause. "I used to watch him do it and think, you're not learning anything if you're busy explaining it away." Silas tied off the binding on her left hand. "Was that about me just now, or about him?" "About him," she said. "You're the opposite problem. You take on too much of it." "The bolt was my responsibility." "The bolt was our responsibility. We designed the rig together." She flexed her right hand carefully, testing the binding. "You just said it yourself. Neither of us thought about cold tolerance on the iron. That means we both missed it. Don't carry it alone." He set down the remaining cloth strips and looked at her hands on the table between them. Bandaged and swollen, the most important instruments either of them had, temporarily damaged. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. It was the closest thing to absolution either of them was inclined to offer. The saboteurs came 11 days later. Silas heard them before he saw them, which was the only reason things went the way they did. He'd been sleeping lighter since the rig failure, some watchfulness that the incident had left running in him. And when the sound came at 2 in the morning, it pulled him up fast. Not the creek, not the wind. Footsteps, plural, on the frozen ground near the mill, heavier than an animal and less careful than they should have been. He was out of his bunk and at the door in seconds, in his boots and coat, without quite remembering pulling them on. 3 men. He could see them in the moonlight on the snow. two at the base of the wheel housing with something in their hands, one standing back near the platform edge as a lookout. The two at the housing were working at the lower boards with what looked like an axe and a pry bar. The lookout saw Silas come out of the cabin and had approximately 2 seconds to decide what to do, which wasn't enough time to do anything useful. Silas crossed the yard at a run that the cold ground made uneven but didn't slow significantly, and the lookout made the understandable decision to go sideways rather than stand in the path of something that size moving that fast. The two at the housing heard him coming and turned, and the one with the axe made the worst of the two possible decisions and swung it, which Silas stepped inside of, too close for the axe to have any meaningful arc, and put him on the ground with his arm twisted at an angle that made further axe work impractical. The second man dropped the pry bar and ran, which Silas let happen, because holding one and chasing another simultaneously was not realistic, and the one he had was the more important problem. The lookout was gone. The man with the axe was on the ground on his stomach, with Silas's knee in his back and his arms still at the unhelpful angle, making sounds that communicated discomfort clearly. Silas looked at the housing. They'd gotten 3 boards off, which was damage but not disaster. A few more minutes and they'd have reached the wheel assembly, and damage there would have cost weeks. "Who sent you?" Silas said. The man said something that wasn't an answer. Silas applied a small amount of additional pressure to the arm. "Who sent you?" Nobody sent. You came out at 2 in the morning with tools to tear apart a sawmill because you felt like it." A pause with more discomfort in it. "I need the arm. I need it for work." "Then tell me something useful." Another pause. Silas waited. He was cold and tired, and his shoulder, which had been improving, had now been re-aggravated by the whole business, but he was not in a hurry. Patience was something he had in quantity. "Hargrove," the man said finally. "Not directly. A man who works for him. Said he'd pay $20 if we—" He stopped. "If you wrecked the mill." Silence. $20, Silas said. He thought about what $20 meant to a man who'd do this kind of work for it. He thought about the rifle he'd sold for $105 and what it would have meant to still have it right now. He thought about a lot of things in a short space of time. "Get up, slowly. Pick up the boards you pulled off and put them back where you found them." The man got up slowly. His arm was going to hurt for a week, but it was intact, which he clearly understood was a more generous outcome than the situation warranted. He picked up the boards and put them back without being told again. "You're going to go back to whoever gave you the job," Silas said, "and you're going to tell him it didn't work. And if I see you near this property again, the arm conversation will go differently." He picked up the axe from the ground and looked at it. Decent axe, actually. "I'm keeping this." The man left across the frozen ground at a speed that suggested he'd reconsidered the $20. Silas stood at the mill for a long time after, in the cold, checking the housing and the wheel assembly by lantern light. The boards came off cleanly and went back without damage. The wheel assembly was untouched. The axle and the mounts were exactly where they'd been set, exactly as Evelyn had checked them with bleeding hands in the February afternoon. He went back to the cabin. Evelyn was sitting at the table. She'd heard all of it, he realized. The footsteps, the sounds, possibly the conversation, certainly the general shape of what had happened. "3 of them," he said. "I counted 2 sets of footsteps clearly. I assumed a 3rd from the sound distribution." She had her hands flat on the table, her bandaged hands, which were healing but still wrapped. The mill, 3 boards off the housing, nothing else reached. He sat down. His shoulder was telling him about itself at considerable length. Hargrove. Through an intermediary. Of course, through an intermediary. He won't touch anything directly. Her voice was flat in a way that wasn't calm, was instead the sound of anger with nowhere to go because the target wasn't present. $20. That's what the man said. Hargrove spends $20 to destroy months of our work, and he loses nothing if it fails. She pressed her hands carefully against the table surface. While we have nothing left to lose that we haven't already lost," Silas said, "which is why we're still here." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll try again," she said, "not the same way. Something more careful." "I know. We're too close to finishing for him to wait." "I know that too." Silas looked at the fire. "How long until we can run the first cut?" 3 weeks. Maybe less if the weather turns. What's left? The gear train final assembly, the blade mounting in alignment, the water intake gate which you've been building the mechanism for. She went through it without hesitation, the list coming out in the order she kept it in her head. And the channel clearing, the intake channel needs the winter debris removed so the flow is clean to the wheel. 2 weeks of solid work, he said. If we push, then we push. He looked at her. Starting tomorrow. Your shoulder? Starting tomorrow, he said again. She recognized the tone and didn't argue it. What followed was the hardest 2 weeks of the entire build, and the previous weeks had not been easy. Silas worked through the shoulder pain with the kind of deliberate, controlled stubbornness that isn't bravery so much as refusal to accept the alternative, taking the load on his left side where he could and managing the right with enough function to keep moving. Evelyn's hands were well enough by the third day to do most of what she needed, though she didn't mention the ones that still hurt, and he didn't ask because they were both past the point where cataloging discomfort had any useful function. The gear train final assembly was Evelyn's domain more than anything else in the build. This was the system that translated the wheel's rotation into the blade's movement, and the precision required in the gear spacing and alignment was the kind of thing that in a properly equipped shop would have taken surveying instruments and machined fittings. What they had was Evelyn's hands, Silas's eyes, the measurement guides they'd built, and several hundred hours of combined thinking about exactly this problem. They worked on it together for 4 days. Not side by side exactly, but in the close quarters communication they'd developed over months. Her calling adjustments, him making them, her checking with her hands what his eyes had done, him describing what he saw while she ran calculations to verify it. By the second day they had settled into a pace that was almost wordless, not because they had nothing to say, but because they'd developed enough shared language about the work that whole exchanges could happen in 3 words and a gesture she couldn't see but could infer from the sound of his movement. Tension on the main drive, she said on the third day. Even. He ran the gear by hand, feeling the resistance. Clean engagement all the way around. The secondary. Same, maybe slightly stiffer at the 3 o'clock position. Which tooth? Can't tell from hand turning. I'd need it under load. It'll free up under load if the stiffness is what I think it is. Run it by hand 50 more revolutions. She was holding the drive shaft lightly, feeling vibration through the metal. I want to know if it's consistent or if it's a specific tooth. He ran it 50 revolutions. Consistent. Same position every time. Gear spacing is a hair wide at that segment. We need to close it by... She paused, and he could see her doing the arithmetic in her head. No more than a 16th of an inch, probably less. That's bench work. Yes. She took the gear off the shaft. Give me an hour. He gave her an hour and spent it clearing debris from the intake channel, which was cold, wet work, involving lying on the frozen bank of the creek with his arms in water that was just above freezing and reaching into the channel to pull out the sticks and ice chunks and compacted leaves that a winter's worth of flow had packed into the intake grate. By the time Evelyn called him back to the gear train, he couldn't feel his hands below the wrist, which made the fine work she asked him to do next an exercise in concentrating very hard and moving slowly. She noticed the stiffness in his hands immediately when he picked up the gear. Creek work, she said. Intake needed clearing. How long were your arms in the water? Long enough. Silas? My hands work fine, he said. Tell me where you need this set. She told him. He said it. It took longer than it should have because his fingers weren't cooperating at full capacity, but he said it right, and when she checked it with her own hand, she said, "That's it," in the tone that meant exactly that, and nothing else. Then she went to the hearth and brought him the mug that had been sitting near the fire, and set it on the workbench beside him, without a word. He looked at it. Hot water with some dried herbs in it. Not coffee. They'd been out of coffee for 3 weeks. But hot. He picked it up and drank it, and she went back to the gear train, and neither of them mentioned it. It was toward the end of the second week, on a Tuesday evening, that Evelyn said the thing she'd been not saying for some time. They'd finished for the day and Silas was at the table working on the intake gate mechanism by lamplight, while she sat across from him with her rope model, and the cabin had the kind of quiet it got when they were both tired enough that the edges of the day's effort were showing. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About the property." He looked up. "I did something last fall," she said, Before you came, when I was running out of options. She set the rope model down on the table. I hired a land surveyor, the last of what I had. He came out and did a proper survey of the property boundaries. All right. Hargrove's claim, both his claims, were based on the original homestead deed, which describes the property boundaries in terms of a fence line and some natural markers that have moved or disappeared over 30 years. She paused. The surveyor found something. The original deed placed the homestead in one location. The actual homestead, where my late husband built it, sits 40 feet northwest of where the deed describes. Silas was still. 40 feet, he said. 40 feet northwest, which puts it on a different land grant entirely, one that predates Hargrove's bank's charter. She kept her hands flat on the table. Hargrove's debt claims were collateralized against property he may not have legal claim to foreclose on, because the property isn't where the deed says it is. Silas worked through this. And the mill. I asked the surveyor about the mill site specifically, Evelyn said. He confirmed it. The mill site falls within the older land grant, not within the Ashcroft homestead deed at all. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the creek ran. You've known this since last fall, he said. Since October. Before I arrived. Yes. And you didn't tell me. She met the general direction of his voice with her face in that way she had. I didn't know you in October, she said. I didn't know if you'd stay. I didn't know if you were trustworthy. I didn't know anything about you except that you paid a debt you had no obligation to pay. A pause. And I needed someone who was building this mill because they believed it was worth building, not because they thought there was legal protection making it safer. He sat with that, looked at the lamp, looked back at her. Fair, he said. I should have told you sooner once I knew you better. Yes, you should have. He leaned back in his chair. But I understand why you didn't. He thought about Hargrove, about the revised plan he'd seen on Hargrove's face the day he'd paid the debt, about the saboteurs and the $20 and the legal attacks and all of it. He doesn't know. He knows about the survey. He couldn't have prevented it. Surveys are public record once filed, but I don't believe he's understood the implication yet. He's been focused on the debt as his instrument. When he does understand, he'll try a legal claim, she said. Probably. But the land grant documentation predates anything he can use, and the survey is filed. She paused. I've been waiting for him to realize it. Every time he makes a move against the debts, he's using up his credibility and his resources on a fight he can't win once the land question is settled in court. Silas looked at her, across the table. At the woman who'd been sitting in this cabin for 3 years, blind and in debt and running out of everything, building not just a mill plan but a legal strategy, who had actually waited, for the right person to come along and build the physical thing while she held the rest of it. You've been setting him up, he said. I've been protecting myself, she said, with what I had. Which was your mind. Which was the only thing nobody could take from me, she said. And there was something in it that wasn't pride exactly. Something older and more worn than pride, but not broken. Not even close to broken. Silas sat for a while longer. The lamp burned. The creek ran. His shoulder ached with the specific persistence of an injury that was going to take its own time, regardless of what he preferred. 3 weeks, he said. You said 3 weeks until first cut. 2.5 now. Then let's finish it. She picked up her rope model. He picked up the intake gate mechanism. They went back to work. The intake gate went in on a Thursday morning in the first week of March, when the temperature had climbed just enough that the ground near the creek bank was soft rather than frozen solid, which made the final fitting work possible without breaking tools on the earth. Silas set the gate mechanism while Evelyn stood on the platform above him with one hand on the gear train housing, waiting. The gate was the last major component, a hinged iron and wood assembly that would control the flow of water from the creek into the intake channel and from there to the wheel. When he closed it now, the creek divided around the channel mouth and kept going downstream unchanged. When he opened it, Mill Creek would stop being just a creek and become the engine of everything they'd built. He fitted the gate pin into its bracket and tested the swing, open, closed, open, 3 times. Smooth, which surprised him given how much of the mechanism they'd built from improvised parts. Pins in, he called up. Test the stop on the closed position, Evelyn said. He closed it hard, let it find its stop. Solid. and the chain connection to the upper lever. He connected the chain to the operating lever they'd mounted on the platform above, a system that let the gate be opened and closed from the platform rather than requiring someone to wade into the creek. Evelyn put both hands on the lever when he came up to join her. "This controls it," she said. Not a question, she was acquainting herself with it. "Pull toward you opens the gate, push away closes it." She moved the lever through its range, feeling the resistance, the chain movement, the mechanical relationship. She did it 4 times. He waited. "All right," she said. She didn't let go of the lever. "Is there anything left?" He looked at the mill. He went through it in his head the way he went through everything before he committed to a judgment, not rushing, not looking for permission to say yes. The wheel was complete and sitting in its housing, the axle running true through both mounts. The gear train connected the axle to the drive shaft to the blade assembly, which held 3 blades that would take raw timber and produce cut lumber. The platform was solid. The housing was intact and repatched where the saboteurs had pulled boards. The intake channel was clear. There was nothing left. "No," he said. "Nothing left." Evelyn's hand was still on the lever. Her knuckles weren't white. She wasn't gripping it hard. She was just holding it, the way you hold something you've been moving toward for a long time when you've finally reached it and aren't quite ready to do the last thing. 3 years, she said, and it wasn't aimed at him or at anyone, just said. He didn't answer. Some things you let stand without response. After a moment, she pulled the lever toward her. He heard the gate open, heard the creak sound change as water divided and found the channel, heard it build in the channel, the rushing sound of collected volume moving with purpose, heard the first contact with the lowest paddle of the wheel, a deep, resonant knock that was the sound of water meeting wood at force, and then the second paddle, and the wheel began to turn, slowly at first. The gear train took the rotation and stepped it up, and the drive shaft began to move, and the blade assembly started its travel. There was a grinding sound in the first 30 seconds that made Silas's jaw tighten before he identified it as the gear at the 3 o'clock position, the slightly stiff one that Evelyn had said would free up under load. It ran rough for perhaps 45 seconds, and then smoothed out as the metal seated properly under the force it was designed to carry. The mill was running. Silas stood on the platform and listened to it, the wheel turning, the gears moving, the blade assembly making its mechanical circuit, and felt something he didn't have a precise word for. Not pride exactly, something more specific than that, the feeling of a thing being what it was designed to be, doing what it was built to do. Evelyn stood beside him with both hands at her sides, not holding anything, not touching anything, just listening. He watched her face while she listened. She wasn't smiling. She looked like someone who had just received information they'd been waiting a long time to receive and were in the process of integrating it fully before deciding what to feel about it. "The gear," she said. 30 seconds, then it cleared. "About that. I thought it might take longer." So did I. She was quiet for another moment, her head slightly angled toward the wheel's sound. "The water volume is lower than peak flow. This is late winter flow." "Yes. When it reaches spring levels, the torque increases. We'll be able to run larger timber." "Yes," he said again. She turned her face toward him. "We should cut something." They cut a pine log that had been sitting on the platform for a week in anticipation of this moment, a log Silas had selected for straightness and consistent diameter, one that would give them clean feedback on how the blades were running. He fed it into the guide while the mill made its noise around them, and the blade took it with a sound that was loud and mechanical and completely normal, and on the other side came lumber. Rough cut, needing finishing, but dimensionally correct to within margins that he didn't need to measure to recognize. He carried the cut piece to Evelyn and put it in her hands. She ran both palms along the surface, feeling the cut face, the edges, the consistency. She went slowly. He watched her do it and didn't say anything. "Consistent," she said. "The cut face is even, no blade wander." She felt the edge profile. "Depth is right." "It's right," he confirmed. She held the lumber in both hands for a moment. A single piece of cut pine, rough and smelling of fresh wood, nothing remarkable about it except that it was the first piece they'd ever made, and everything that came before it had been building toward it. She set it down carefully on the platform surface. "Good," she said. He'd come to understand, one of the highest things she said about anything. Hargrove moved within the week, which was faster than Silas had expected, and about when Evelyn had predicted. He sent a man with a legal document to the property on a Monday morning, not a bank clerk this time, an actual attorney from the county seat, which told Silas that Hargrove had been spending money on this and had decided to spend more. Silas read the document. He understood about 2/3 of the legal language and enough of the rest to get the shape of it. Hargrove was claiming ownership of the mill site based on an interpretation of the original Ashcroft homestead deed that expanded its boundaries to include the creek frontage. He brought it inside and read it aloud to Evelyn. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He found a surveyor willing to reinterpret the boundary language, she said. I expected this. His surveyor's interpretation conflicts with the filed survey. Yes, which is why this goes to court. She turned her head slightly. Did the attorney say when? He said Hargrove's filing would be with the county court by end of month. We'd have time to respond. We have the survey. We have the land grant documentation. We have dated records of the construction. She paused. And we have the mill running, which matters more than people realize. A running enterprise on disputed land changes the legal calculus significantly. Courts are reluctant to shut down something that's operating and employing and producing. We're not employing anyone yet. We will be before the court date, she said. We have timber orders to fill. I'll hire 2 men this week. He looked at her. We can afford that. We've had 4 orders since word got out that we were running. Hendricks at the trading post, 2 homesteaders from the Upper Valley, and Tom Greer wants finished lumber for an addition. She said it without emphasis, as though this were information she'd been managing and had simply not yet reported. At our rates, 2 weeks of production covers a month's wages for 2 men, and then some. He sat down at the table. You've been taking orders. Clara has been taking orders on my behalf since she goes to town. I told her what to charge. A brief pause. I should have told you. When did this start? About 10 days ago, when I was certain the mill would run. He thought about saying something about the pattern, about the things she decided and managed without telling him, the information she held until she determined it was relevant, the plans built in compartments she opened one at a time. He thought about whether it bothered him. It did, a little. And it also didn't, because he understood by now that it was structural to who she was, built by years of being a blind woman in a world that wanted to manage her, who'd learned that controlling information was one of the few forms of control available to her. You could ask her to share more and she'd try, and she had been trying, and he'd accept the rest as the cost of who she was, because who she was had gotten them here. Tell me sooner, he said, about the orders and everything else. I'm your partner, not someone you report to when the plan is finished. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I'm working on it. It was, he understood, a genuine statement, not an apology and not a deflection, just an honest account of something she was trying to change and hadn't fully changed yet. All right, he said, who are you thinking for the 2 men? She told him. The court date came in the last week of April, by which time the mill had been running for 6 weeks and had produced enough lumber to make itself a fact in the valley's economy rather than a rumor. Chet Dobbs had placed an order, as Evelyn had said he would. The 2 homesteaders from the Upper Valley had told other homesteaders. There were 4 men working the mill on a rotating basis now, and the road outside the property had a worn track in it from the freight wagons that had become a semi-regular feature of the week. The people of Black Ridge had not, for the most part, dramatically reversed their opinion of Silas and Evelyn. That was not how small towns worked. What they'd done was quietly update their behavior, stopping by with questions about lumber prices, asking about availability, making the small practical acknowledgments of a business that had become relevant to their lives without ever explicitly admitting that they'd been wrong to laugh. Some of them managed a kind of side-angled respect that was the closest they could get to an apology. Most of them just showed up with orders and left the rest unaddressed, which was also a kind of answer. Roy Pettit had not returned to the property edge since Silas had spoken to him in December. Silas neither expected nor required any different acknowledgement from Roy than the silence. The county courthouse was in a town called Mather, 12 miles from Black Ridge, which Silas made in 2.5 hours on Cobb through the late April mud. Evelyn rode beside him on a borrowed horse, sitting straight in the saddle in a way that did not advertise the fact that she'd practiced the route 3 times in the past 2 weeks to understand its terrain by sound and feel. She had hired an attorney named Garrett, a thin, precise man from the county seat who had looked at the land grant documentation and the survey filing and the mill's operating records and said, "This is a sound case," with the careful understatement of someone who believed it was a very sound case and wasn't willing to say that outright in case something went wrong. Hargrove arrived at the courthouse with his own attorney, and 2 men Silas didn't recognize who had the look of people brought for effect. Hargrove himself looked like he'd been eating poorly and sleeping less, a tightness around his jaw and eyes that hadn't been there in December. 6 weeks of the mill running and the valley shifting its lumber business toward Mill Creek Road had apparently not agreed with him. He saw Silas and Evelyn in the hallway and said nothing. His attorney said nothing. They all went into the courtroom and sat on opposite sides and waited for the judge. Silas had not been in many courtrooms. He found them strange, the way he found most formal institutions strange, as if someone had decided that the place where important things were decided should look as unlike the actual world as possible. The high ceiling and the wood paneling and the flag in the corner and the judge's elevated position all said this is serious, which was fine, but they also said this is a world governed by specific performances, which he was less comfortable with. Evelyn sat beside him and Garrett sat beside her, and they listened while both attorneys made their arguments. Silas understood enough of it to follow the shape. Hargrove's attorney argued that the homestead deed's description of boundaries, properly interpreted against contemporary landmarks, placed the mill site within the collateralized property. Garrett argued that the filed survey, an objective measurement conducted by a licensed surveyor and entered into public record, established the actual boundaries and superseded interpretive claims about deed language. Then Evelyn spoke. She'd discussed this with Garrett, and Garrett had initially resisted it. He'd said the case was sufficient on the documentary evidence and additional testimony risked muddying the water. Evelyn had said no, she wanted to speak, and she'd said it once, and something in how she said it had apparently convinced Garrett that arguing further was not efficient. She stood at the witness position with her hands on the railing and her face toward the judge, and she spoke without notes, because she didn't use notes. She explained the survey. She explained the land grant. She explained the founding date of the original land grant versus the date of incorporation of Hargrove's bank. She did it without legal language and without drama, in the plain, specific way she talked about everything, as though the facts were the argument and needed no decoration, which they were, and they didn't. Then she said, "I have been blind since I was 32 years old. I cannot read a document in front of you, and I cannot point to a map on a wall. What I can tell this court is that I spent 3 years memorizing every land record, every survey notation, and every measurement relevant to this property, and I can reproduce any of them accurately from memory. I have built a working mill on this land. I have employed 4 men from this valley. I am serving lumber orders to businesses and homesteaders at prices that have reduced their costs by 30%. I ask this court to weigh that reality against a document interpretation that serves one man's interest in acquiring property he has never worked and never built on." She sat down. The judge was quiet for a moment after she sat down. Garrett, beside her, did not look like a man who regretted her testimony. Hargrove's attorney tried a rebuttal that covered the same ground his initial argument had covered, and the second time through it sounded thinner. The judge asked 3 questions, all of them technical, all of them directed at the land grant documentation, and Garrett answered 2 of them, and Evelyn answered the 3rd from memory without being asked to. The ruling came 2 hours later. The filed survey was the operative boundary documentation. The mill site fell outside the scope of the original Ashcroft homestead deed, and therefore outside the scope of any debt collateral. Hargrove's claim was dismissed. Hargrove stood up from his chair when the ruling was read, and his attorney put a hand on his arm and he sat back down. He didn't say anything. What he'd planned, what he'd spent months and money pursuing, had stopped in a courtroom in Mather on a Tuesday in late April. And the thing that had stopped it was a blind woman who'd memorized land records in a cold cabin while she waited for something to build with. He left without speaking to anyone. Silas watched him go and felt none of the satisfaction he'd expected to feel. Not much of anything, actually. The man was diminished and defeated and had spent his own resources on a failure he'd constructed himself, and that was its own complete consequence. Outside the courthouse, In the early afternoon light that had the good quality of genuine spring rather than the fraud of February's warm spell, Evelyn stood at the top of the courthouse steps and said nothing for a moment. He stood beside her. "It's over," he said. "The legal question is over," she said. "The mill keeps running regardless." "Yes." She turned her face toward the warmth of the sun in the way people do when they've been cold a long time and aren't quite ready to accept that it might last. "I need to go back and check the blade assembly," she said. "I've been thinking about the upper bearing. I want you to listen to it running and tell me if you hear any irregularity. You were in a courtroom 2 hours ago." "The blade assembly doesn't care where I was," she said. "It either needs adjustment or it doesn't." He almost smiled, caught it a fraction slower than usual. "All right, we'll check the blade assembly." They rode back to Black Ridge through the spring mud, and the valley looked different in April than it had in December. Softer, the trees starting to think about leaves, the creek running higher with snowmelt that would increase the mill's power for the next 2 months. It looked like a place where something was possible, which it had looked like in December too, but only if you knew what to look for. He was thinking about the rifle when they were about 3 miles from the property. He hadn't thought about it in weeks, had made something like peace with selling it the way he made peace with most things he couldn't change, by putting it somewhere he didn't visit too often. He thought about it now because the spring light and the specific quality of coming back from somewhere put him in a reflective mood he didn't usually indulge. It had been the right decision. He knew that completely. But right decisions still cost what they cost. When they got back to the property, 4 freight wagons were waiting in the road with orders, which meant the rest of the afternoon was going to be occupied with lumber inventory and pricing discussions, and the particular negotiations of new customers who hadn't yet established what kind of terms they could expect. Evelyn took these conversations with a precision that Silas had watched develop over weeks. She'd been uncertain in the first few negotiations, feeling out the language of commerce in a context she hadn't operated in before. And she'd made a few pricing decisions she'd later revised. But she learned fast and she retained everything, and by April she was running her end of a business with the same methodical thoroughness she'd brought to the engineering. He handled the physical side, loading, measuring, verifying quality before it left the property. She handled the pricing, the terms, the records she kept in her head, and had Clara transcribe weekly into a ledger. One of the freight drivers, a man named Uckins who'd worked the valley roads for 15 years, stood in the yard watching Evelyn negotiate with another customer, and then said to Silas, without particular malice, just something like genuine puzzlement, "How's she do it, the numbers and all?" "Same way you read a map," Silas said. "She just does it a different way than you." Uckins thought about this. "I heard people say she was helpless." "People say a lot of things." "Yeah." Akins watched her for another moment. "Reckon they do." It was 3 weeks after the courthouse when Silas came back from checking the upper snare lines he'd set out of habit and found a package on the table in the cabin, wrapped in trade cloth, tied with cord. His name was written on it in Clara's handwriting, which meant Evelyn had asked Clara to write the label. He looked at Evelyn. She was at the table, hands folded in front of her with a deliberateness that meant she was waiting for something and was trying not to appear to be waiting. "What is this?" he said. "Open it." He untied the cord and unwrapped the cloth. The Whitmore rifle looked back at him. His rifle. 11 years of work and weather and country in the stock, the action, the way the metal had worn specifically to his use. He stood holding it for a long moment, not saying anything because he didn't have anything to say. "Dunmore had it," Evelyn said. "He hadn't sold it. Clara found out and told me." A pause. "We had enough from the first month's profit." He looked at the rifle and then at her. She was facing him with her hands still folded on the table, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite comfortable. The slight tension of someone who has done something that mattered and isn't sure how it will land. "You remembered," he said. "I remember everything," she said. "You know that." And then quieter. "But I would have remembered this regardless." He set the rifle down on the table carefully and sat down across from her. He thought about December, and the snow, and the trading post, and putting the rifle on Dunmore's counter and walking out into the cold. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. The single nod that was a period. They sat for a moment in the silence that had accumulated between them over months. Not an empty silence anymore. Not the careful distance of two people sharing space who don't yet know each other. something fuller than that, something built from the same materials as the mill, from work and argument and cold nights and small adjustments and learning each other's instruments until they ran true. He thought about what it meant, the two of them. Not what the town called them, not the custom or the legal arrangement or any of the external categories. Just the actual thing, two people who had come together out of necessity and stayed together out of something harder to name and more durable than necessity. Who had built something real in the cold when everyone watching assumed they couldn't. Who had fought Hargrove in February and their own separate stubbornnesses and the very human tendency to hold things back when you should be handing them over. They weren't a simple story. They'd never been a simple story. They were two difficult, private, imperfect people who'd found, almost accidentally, that the other person was someone they could trust with the things that mattered. And that trust had turned out to be rarer and more worth protecting than either of them had known they were looking for. Outside, the creek ran with its spring volume, high and full, and pushing the wheel at the best speed it had run all season. He could hear the gear train from the cabin. That sound had become part of how the cabin sounded, the way the wind was part of it, the way the creek was, built into the background of ordinary life. "Blade assembly?" he said. "Yes." She stood. "The upper bearing. I want you to listen." He picked up the Whitmore and set it carefully in the corner where it belonged, and they went outside into the spring afternoon, and the mill ran around them, and the valley stretched out toward the Callaway Peaks, still wearing their last snow. And in Black Ridge, 12 miles of mud and spring road away, the people who had once laughed were putting in orders. The town wouldn't remember the laughter clearly in another year. Memory was convenient that way. It softened the embarrassing parts and enlarged the parts a person could live with comfortably. By next winter, most of Black Ridge would recall that they'd always thought Silas Mercer was a capable man, and Evelyn Ashcroft was a sharp woman. And if they'd had doubts, well, doubts were natural, weren't they? Nobody would remember Roy Pettit's voice at the property edge, or Chet Dobbs watching from down the road, or the particular quality of the crowd outside the bank on that December morning. Silas and Evelyn would remember. But they weren't interested in keeping score. They were interested in the upper bearing. There are people in the world who build things, and people who find reasons why things can't be built. The second kind is always more numerous and always louder, and is almost always wrong, and they never quite figure out why. What they miss, what they always miss, is that the people doing the building aren't operating on confidence or optimism or any of the things observers think they're operating on. They're operating on something more stubborn than that. The willingness to do the next thing and the thing after that, regardless of how the thing before it went. The willingness to be cold and wrong and hurt and broke, and to keep the work moving anyway. Evelyn had done that for 3 years alone, in the dark, with nothing but time and her own mind. Silas had done it his whole life, moving through country that didn't care about him, building the specific competencies that had no audience until they did. They had found each other at the exact moment both of them needed what the other had, which was not fate or luck, but arithmetic. If you move through the world doing real things, eventually you run into someone else doing real things. And if you're both practical enough to recognize it, you don't let it pass. Evelyn put her hand on the upper housing of the blade assembly and said, "Run it again." He ran it. She listened. "Left?" she said. "Barely. But it's there." He listened too. She was right. A faint irregularity, barely at the threshold of audible, that meant a slight misalignment in the bearing that would become a real problem in 3 months if they left it. "I'll pull the housing this afternoon," he said. "I'll tell you what to check. I know what to check. I'll tell you anyway." He looked at her, hand on the mill housing, head angled toward the sound of the bearing, already working on the problem. And he didn't catch the smile this time. She probably heard it anyway.
I found a fucking beating heart.
How much is it worth?
Oh, God.
My God, bro. The fucking plants are here.
house.
I don't know where the fuck anything is, man. Oh my god! They killed the butler!
What? I'm dead.
Oh, there's bugs!
What killed the bug?
Chandler, teleport me, please! Oh my god. Okay, the butler's dead. Dude, it's all fucking body parts in there, man.
They didn't show up as a red dot at all.
Yeah, it's okay. Well, we go back. I'm getting fucking camped!
Don't leave me alone with this freak.
There's fucking bugs in this building because they came out the butler. What the fuck? How am I supposed to get the fucking stuff? And I'm just getting camped by bugs.